Welcome to the City Current Show, powered by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
This show focuses on sharing good news and powering the good in our community. Now here's your host, City Current CEO, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the City Current Show, powered by Higginbotham. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you inspiring stories of individuals and organizations making a difference and powering the good. And in this case, we're sharing some history. That's why we're super excited to be talking about a new book, Townmania, Marcus Winchester, and the Making of Memphis. We have with us the author, Scott Williams. He's dedicated to uncovering forgotten stories in American history and culture. He's also the president and CEO of Discovery Park of America. But Scott, how are you doing?
Fantastic. Great to see you again, Jeremy. It's been a while. I think we probably wore masks the last time we hung out.
Well, we did a virtual tour of Discovery Park of America. It was amazing. We were talking about that before and just, how awesome that was. And so we have a lot more coming up. But let's start with Discovery Park of America because it is president and CEO, the role for you, but it also does tie into you writing this book. So give us a little bit of a snapshot on Discovery Park of America.
Sure. So Discovery Park of America is about 2 hours north of Memphis up here in Union City, Tennessee. We have a mission of inspiring children and adults to see beyond, as we say. And that means no matter who you are, when you visit Discovery Park, we want you to experience new things in the areas of history, science, technology, transportation. I mean, if people haven't been here, they cannot imagine how much is here on our 50 acres in our 100,000 square foot museum. So we have a real focus this coming up year on America 250 and Tennessee's celebration. So the book kind of tied into all the things we're doing to celebrate in 2026.
You also have some ties to Memphis, correct?
Right. I am a Memphian. I grew up in Parkway Village, where the Mall of Memphis used to be. I rode my big wheel in the trails where the Mall of Memphis would one day go. So I definitely am a long-time Memphian who traveled around a bit, but was able to return back to Tennessee about 7 years ago.
So let's dive into the book Townmania, Marcus Winchester, and the Making of Memphis. And as I mentioned in the onset, forgotten stories. And so, when you talk about Marcus Winchester and really, the starting of the city, forgotten story, but yet there's a lot of depth to this. So let's start out. What led you to write this book?
Sure. So when my previous book was about David Crockett. And so when I wrote about David Crockett, there was a moment in his life story where he crashed a flatboat loaded with barrel staves that he was trying to get to New Orleans from up here in my neck of the woods currently. And he crashed, his boat sank. He lost, any investment that he had, now suddenly he was even worse than broke. He was in debt. And so a steamboat came along and took him to Memphis, where he met Marcus Winchester and his wife, Amarante Loisel, and they became very good friends. Secretly, Marcus Winchester then began funding David Crockett's congressional campaigns. And so even though he lost all of his money, he made a good connection that helped him fund his campaigns. But just the way he wrote about Marcus Winchester and Amarante Loisel and their presence in the city triggered something in my curious mind. Why do I not know about this guy? If he helped start the city, you would think that I would have, as a Memphian, you would think that there would be a big statue of him, down on Front Street or something. And so I just started researching, and the more I researched, the more their life story really piqued my interest. And, I wanted to see, is there a book here? So there obviously was.
Absolutely. And the more you get into it, like I said, it's a really interesting story in his life journey. You start the book with him around 17 years old as a prisoner of war. So talk about kind of that juxtaposition of where you start the book.
Yeah. So to me, it was just an interesting point in his life, he was at that age where all of us try to figure out, what are we going to do with our lives? There are letters between Marcus Winchester's father and his uncle. With his father was very concerned that Marcus Winchester wasn't showing a lot of ambition in one particular area or another. He was attending school up in Baltimore, where his father's family was from. And so Marcus Winchester's dad was hot and heavy to get into the War of 1812. And so he campaigned to become a brigadier general, pulled his son out of school, and made him his unofficial aide de camp. And so Marcus Winchester was there with his dad as they fought and were captured. And he was a prisoner of war for a while. And then eventually his dad was able to be released, as was he. But his dad's reputation as being a really bad brigadier general, suffered. And so Marcus Winchester, I think that contributed a little bit to the further development of his career as he saw how bad the PR could be. His dad was just annihilated, in the public with some really horrible political cartoons even that were published around the world. So his dad really, James Winchester was his name. And so James Winchester, Andrew Jackson, and John Overton were all buddies and business partners. And so when the time came to find somebody to go to Memphis to help develop it, that was the land that they owned, they leaned on young Marcus Winchester to go because he had nothing else to do. And I'm sure James Winchester was thinking, hey, let's, maybe this will help him. Because, he had brothers who were very successful in Baltimore, very successful in New Orleans, traders, who did, great, and he was just, trying to find his way. And so he did land ultimately in Memphis when it was basically a village of like 50 fur traders, Native Americans, people who traveled on flatboats. So it was just a very small little group of people when he showed up and said, hello, I'm Marcus Winchester.
But he also, too, was ahead of his time. When you look at what he saw as the potential as a logistics hub, how to build commerce, banking, bakery, like all of these things, we'll dive into, but really powerful. Talk about the title, Townmania, because I think it's an interesting title that you found kind of in some notes as a reference, but it talks about the urgency. So talk about Townmania as the title.
Yeah, sure. So, for James Winchester, for John Overton, and for Andrew Jackson, this was purely a financial deal. They were in a hurry. There's a letter that I ran across in the Tennessee State Library and Archives from James Winchester, Marcus's dad, to John Overton that said, we need to go fast because Townmania is not going to last long. And this was people from the East and people from other, parts of North Carolina and, trying to take over land, coming in as quickly as they could because of the Delta and because of how well this whole West Tennessee was for agriculture. And then, of course, also the tributaries. We're very blessed here in West Tennessee. We don't realize it now, but back then it was crucial that they had the Forked Deer River, the Obion River, all the Wolf River, all those rivers were able to take product down the river to get to Memphis to be able to sell it. So Marcus Winchester saw all that. And there's a letter from John Overton, who was all about money. And, folks may have heard his name before, in Memphis, about Overton Park, and, but John Overton was all about money. And so there's a letter from him to James Winchester saying, look, Marcus is more focused on selling things in his store he's setting up than he is on dividing the land. So Marcus Winchester was very much about commerce as well, but he also saw it as, and you can tell from reading some of the things he wrote and from his actions, you could tell that he really saw it as a home, as a place for people to live. He very much was passionate about making it into a community, and that really shines in the things that he did. It's also interesting that in many cases, John Overton would try to course correct Marcus Winchester. And to me, it seemed like in the letters, there was a little bit of passive aggressiveness, and then he would say, "Yeah, okay, yeah, no problem." Then he would keep doing whatever he wanted to do. So,
Well, a little bit of youth and defiance, right? Too, like,
right.
but to your point, I think there is a difference when you live there and you say, "This is my home. These are, I'm building community," and he ends up, talking about being a mayor and like all these things. There's a certain then commitment to community that starts to take precedent versus just money, and so I think motives become very different. Sure, you mentioned his wife, and I think there's a lot of complexities to him, which I think really stand out, especially for the time period. Talk about some of the things that really opened your eyes around, as you're looking through the letters and deciphering his life and, sharing it. Talk about some of those complexities, including his wife.
Yeah. So Marcus Winchester married someone who was not white. Her racial makeup is difficult to determine at this point because a lot of evidence has been destroyed or purposefully misconstrued. She was not white, so for all intents and purposes, she might as well have been black the way they treated people then. Now, she was a landowner. She was from an affluent family in St. Louis who were a fur trader, father or stepfather. So she was, a person in her own right, who had obviously intelligence. But it's difficult to really come up with a factual Amarante Loisel because through the years, so much about her was written purposefully with racism in mind. So he married her. They had 8 children together. So his children were biracial. She was black. And so around the time they married, it wasn't as big of a deal as it would become as the fight over slavery intensified and became more and more polarized. And so the rules and the laws and things were different through the years, through their marriage. And so early on, it didn't really matter. If you're just trying to live from one day to the next. You're trying not to get killed by Native Americans. You're trying to farm. You're trying to grow food, and you're trying to get your family fed. So your neighbor's ability to contribute to your livelihood is more important than the color of their skin. But then as it became more and more problematic, they started passing more and more laws, and they started treating African Americans worse. And so a law was passed in Memphis that said a white man cannot have a colored, quote unquote, wife in the city limits. And so here this guy who had really contributed more than anyone else to building this city had to move outside the city limits, which at that time, today it's Midtown, but back then, it was outside the city limits. So they had to build a cabin there, and that's where they lived for the rest of her life. And then he remarried, and his second wife helped raise all those kids, and they stayed there until his death. So it was after that a lot of the writing started to become very much negative about their relationship, about their marriage, and it became like a warning to other people: do not marry someone who is not white because you will be destroyed. The narrative was very much negative, and then it started to be erased. So I had to search and search and search and search to find little tiny little glimmers of the truth. And, I found one letter from a guy from Middle Tennessee who wrote to President Polk and said, you need to get on top of what's happening in Memphis at the post office. The postmaster, who was Marcus Winchester, has taken up with a quote unquote mulatto woman and keeps a child by her in the post office. He needs to be gone. So a lot of things like that, where you see evidence of the treatment that they had to experience.
Share the kind of honest approach that you take regarding that, because when you talk about slavery and politics and racism, you don't shy away from it in the book. So talk about the importance of being factually accurate with what's going on, especially for the time period.
Yeah, so my own ancestors settled in Haywood County in around 1833. And so I know who they were, I know when they were born, I know when they were died, but I've always been really more interested in what was their lives like? What were the politics like that they lived with? What was their community like? You know, and so, we all think we know. We all saw Roots, not you're too young to have seen, but people my age, we saw Roots, we know, we kind of have this image of slavery and this image of the impact of it. But, I found that I was really wrong about what it was like for everyone, whether you had slaves or not. You were impacted by the battle um, over slavery. And so I thought it was really important for people to understand, you know, why did slavery impact someone like Marcus Winchester and his family? And there's letters from him. There's responses to letters from him, and that's a good point. A lot of the things that would clarify some of this it's gone now. Whether it ever existed or not, whether someone in the family cleaned house, so to speak, I don't know. But there are letters from other people back to him acknowledging that it is important for him to be afraid for his family, because back then, if you were not white, you could be picked up off the street and sold into slavery, and that happened over and over and over again. There was also the reverse Underground Railroad, where people might have escaped, but also people were captured and sold into slavery who were free. And so, of course, his children were all free, and so he had to stay on top of that. So there were things like that influenced his decisions, his life, the things he did. If you owned a slave, you couldn't just set them free. It wasn't a matter of just handing them their freedom. It was against the law in many cases and in many states as time progressed. And in Tennessee, if you were given your freedom, you had 1 year to get out of the state. Now, if you had grown up, on a Tennessee farm and you were a slave, it was difficult to suddenly move up north where you could be free, and you very likely would be snatched off the street and sold back into slavery somewhere else down south. So there were a lot of things people did that I put in the book. One, people would put in their wills not to set their slaves free, but to give them a life of freedom. So if your parents left you slaves, they might very well, or enslaved people, they might very well want you to treat them like family members. And so it was very difficult to give people their freedom back then, especially in the 40s and 50s as you got closer and closer to the Civil War.
Talk about Marcus as a visionary when it comes to logistics and business and commerce. You kind of mentioned the postmaster side of it, but I mean, he was involved in so many things. So talk about kind of that piece of it from the commerce and building Memphis.
Yeah, so he was the first mayor. He was the first person to put together a ferry that you could use for charge. He worked very heavily on the railroad system, although he died right before the first railroad in Memphis. So he was very much in charge of transportation, entertainment, hotels, tourism. There was not an area of the growth of the early growth of Memphis that he didn't have his finger in and that he wasn't leading. And so it's very curious to me. You would think there would be more acknowledgement of him. When you grew up in Memphis, you would think you would know him more because of his very high level of contribution. Of course, I can't prove that it's because he married somebody who was not white and that he defied, social customs of the day, but it does look very suspiciously like that.
When you look at having to do this level of research, and like you said, you're going through letters and archives, and it's years worth of research trying to put together the story and be accurate. And, I look at it, the truth is always somewhere in between, right? Like one side and the other side, and you have to figure out what's the truth in between. And so a lot of this, like you said, you're having to do the research, but then kind of make assumptions and figure out, okay, kind of like you said, where it's like a little bit of passive aggressive, maybe a little defiance, right? I'm going to say yes over here, but I'm going to do this. But this is you doing your due diligence to try to piece together someone that, we're a long time removed. Talk about that difficulty of being as accurate as possible, but only going on what you have and trying to, and what's the phrase where it's like the victor is the one that writes the story. And so it's like,
Right.
you got to be able to kind of figure out what the real story is. So talk about that balance.
Well, and I think that is possibly why, no one's really written just about Marcus Winchester before, because there really, as much content as he left behind a lot of business letters that I tried to translate as many of them as I could, but most of them were like reading your emails, your business emails. I mean, it was just like, at some point it wasn't adding anything to the story whatsoever, other than the fact that he really cared a lot about the community. And I tried to include enough of that because you also don't want a boring book. No one's going to benefit if they don't read it. So you want people to read it. But there were just some things like when some of the families started getting sick, he would write to John Overton and say, can you get me some vaccines in Nashville? So there were a lot of things like that I would say, that's a point at which, I should include that. There was a letter back and forth between him and John Overton because there was a particular winter that was so horrible in Memphis and people couldn't even get their wagons out to the woods to get wood. And John Overton and the little business that he had owned the tree line where they could get access. And so Marcus Winchester asked for permission to use some of the wood during that winter, and John Overton said no. And so, he argued, he sent several letters arguing that point. And so you could just kind of tell that he did care about the people that he was with. So things like that I would include. But some things you just have to infer, you just, and I would never make an assumption unless I said, here is an assumption. Here's an assumption one could make if you look at the culture, if you look at the community, if you look at some of the criticisms that he received, towards the end of his life and career. And then you can look at other people who experienced similar things and sort of put that in there so people can kind of, hopefully, by the time they finish the book, they have a sense of what Memphis was like, at the very beginning. And when I go to Memphis all the time. I have a daughter in Memphis. My parents live in Memphis. And so when I'm in Memphis, now, when I'm downtown, I have a whole different feeling inside than I had before, and hopefully other people who read it will have a real appreciation, not just for what Marcus Winchester did, but I included, I bet altogether, I haven't counted them, but there's probably 100 people, individuals that helped settle Memphis and had different roles, whether, one guy who moved in and opened 3 music stores all over that sold sheet music, and, just all these people that came into the community and worked together to make it into what it became today.
Yeah, I think you've already answered kind of where I was going to go next is, what do you hope that readers take away? And I think a deeper appreciation for Memphis as you're walking through and what you experience and how you see the city. And I think the historical perspective too. But carry that into, because you do have music woven throughout, songs, you have ads from the time period. You have a lot of stuff that's strategically woven in. So when you look at all of that together, what do you hope that readers take away from the book, aside from the appreciation of walking through the city and seeing it from a different lens?
Yeah, I think hopefully, not everyone is as passionate about history as I am and as others in the city. Hopefully also they pick up on woven throughout the book are other people who are passionate about history and have written about it and have researched, people who came before me who were, I'm just a dude who runs a museum and loves history. There's some really smart people that, are passionate about the city. And so, I hope people understand why does it matter that this building is falling down? Why do we need to fix it up? Why not just let it fall down? Who cares? The story of the Winchester Cemetery, I think, really highlights that. Marcus Winchester donated this land when his father died. The people from Memphis were buried there. The founders, a lot of the people that you read about in the book who worked really hard to develop Memphis were buried there. It was allowed to crumble. They cut a road through the middle of the cemetery with body parts and coffins and things that were inside the coffins going all over the place. They said, whoops. And so they buried it in the middle of the cemetery, a mayor further down. So let's just take all the headstones and grind them up. It doesn't matter. Just grind them up and, scatter them, and so they ground up the headstones, all that history, and it was scattered into the dirt. Marcus Winchester himself was buried in an unmarked grave. I don't know what, maybe his family marked it. You would think they would, but his grave was not marked enough so that it was kept safe when they got ready to build the city stables. And so in the 1920s, they built the city stables right on top of where we think Marcus Winchester was buried. Through the years, it became a garage. And then now St. Jude, love St. Jude, passionate about their mission. They're building a parking garage there where the Winchester Cemetery is located. And, those who are familiar may know that they ran across bodies while they were digging the garage and had to stop while the bodies were exhumed and moved, hopefully to Elmwood is where they were talking about the last I read. And so, history comes alive when you're thinking about that. Had someone 150 years ago taken care of the Winchester Cemetery the way the Elmwood Cemetery was cared for, it would still be there today, and we would be able to know more about these individuals.
How does this play out? Because history is complex, like we're talking about, and so it gives you a deeper appreciation for the past, but also, too, obviously, just like we're talking about, the future and how we build it. But when you look at other cities and the complexities around the individuals, the history, the moments, how does this kind of change your view, or what sort of view do you have of other cities like Nashville, Fort Worth, Dallas, like all these other cities? How does this kind of play in for them?
Yeah, what's interesting is one of the biggest things that determine what a city becomes, it's its relationship to a river or a major source of traffic. Obviously, Memphis is Memphis because of the river. St. Louis, you look at New Orleans, of course, and river transportation was so important when these cities were beginning. And so you can really see how they sprung up. I mean, you look at Memphis, transportation is king. Elvis is king, but transportation is really king in Memphis. You look at FedEx, you look at the train hubs, the airplanes, the river traffic still. Memphis is transportation. And I think other cities, would kill for the transportation infrastructure that our city has, and I think Marcus Winchester was the first one to actually see that and to actually think, I could really see this being an asset.
When you look at the potential, obviously, for future books and, where you're going with this in terms of the history, but obviously these untold stories, for 2026, this is a pivotal moment in the history for Marcus Winchester. So talk about kind of that piece of it in terms of where we are in this time period for 2026 and kind of the timeliness there, but then also how that paints the future for some of the other stories that are untold, but, you could be telling them.
Yeah, my hope is that this next year is really going to trigger a lot of interest in Americans in their history. It is, for anyone who doesn't know, it is so 2026 is the 230th anniversary of Marcus Winchester's birth. It's the 230th anniversary of Tennessee statehood. It's the bicentennial of Memphis incorporation, and it's the celebration of America 250 that everyone's going to be celebrating. So there's a lot to celebrate in our city, in our state, and in the nation as a whole. And I think anytime there's a focus on something like that, holistically, nationally, it becomes more important. And so I think this is just going to be a great year for those of us that love history to share that love with people who maybe have a passing interest, and hopefully, I remember where I was in when we celebrated the 200th. I'm that old. I can remember that, and being a little kid and having that trigger history, a fascination for history in me. So I'm hoping there's a lot of other little kids out there that this next year are going to discover a love for history.
Well, let's wrap this up. So the book Townmania, Marcus Winchester, and the Making of Memphis. Where do we get the book?
So you can get it on Amazon. You can just search R. Scott Williams and Townmania, and I'll pop up. But you can also get it at Novel. I just got an email from them saying they've got it stocked. So they have them at Novel, and there's a few other. Of course, you can get it at Discovery Park of America and the gift shop. And there'll be other. It just came out, so there'll be other Memphis bookstores that I'm sure will be carrying it as well. But if you just cannot wait, or if you want to read it digital, Amazon is where you can get it.
And then where do we go to learn more and see all the amazing things happening at Discovery Park of America?
Absolutely. You know what? DiscoveryParkofAmerica.com, our website, is a great place to get a broad overview. But if you go to Facebook and search for Discovery Park, you'll see our up-to-the-minute everything going on from the Let It Glow light show to, we have a David Crockett annual Heritage Festival every year. We have an annual powwow. We have car shows. We have all different types of events throughout the year. So we also have 3 brand new hotels right next door. So everybody in Memphis needs to come up here and spend the night and check out Discovery Park and go visit Reelfoot Lake.
Well, Scott, greatly appreciate all you do to power the good. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services is proud to power the City Current Show. We're a people-first company that protects what matters most, the families, businesses, and trailblazers that keep our community going. As one of the nation's top independent insurance firms, Higginbotham is a single-source solution for business insurance, employee benefits, HR services, and personal insurance that's customized for you. We're here to serve you, the people you care about, and your community. Call 866-377-1959 or visit higginbotham.com.